Hello, and welcome back to my lair. Hello everyone, welcome back if you're new here. My name is Madisyn Brown. I make video essays about pop culture and trending topics, and I also make music. I'm a singer and a songwriter, so if you liked the music and the intro, then you can stream it on all platforms, along with my other songs. Today, we are talking about vampires. Yes, vampires are back, baby! And you know what that means? Recession? Maybe, but I will explain that today in this video. As you all know, Sinners has been an absolute box office hit, as well as Noseratu that came out just a few months prior in late 2024, and it seems like vampires are back. They're having a comeback, albeit a bit more of a mature and introspective comeback, but they're back nonetheless. And with the rise of vampire media and popular culture, there's been some speculation, if you will, that vampires are actually a recession indicator. People are theorizing that when vampires make a resurgence in the popular culture, when people are resonating with vampires more, when vampire media is being made more, that it might be a indicator of a recession or financial crisis. And I thought, wow, what a really interesting theory. So I want to see if I can answer that question. And today we're going to be talking all about vampires, going all the way back to the origins of vampire, the myth of vampires, all the way to present day with Sinners, like I just mentioned, coming out. I don't want to spoil it by just saying yes or no, but it is a very kind of complex and layered topic, vampires, and how vampires symbolize different things throughout different periods of time, and I think this is a really interesting video and I hope you guys enjoy it. Speaking of vampire media, today's sponsor Cheeks offers their very own vampire film on their website called Silver V. Before we get on with the rest of the video, I want to talk about Cheeks, a sexual wellness platform that offers expert-led education, immersive audios, and intimate films, all ethically produced and female-friendly. Cheeks is not like other adult platforms that offers male-centered and unrealistic content. Cheeks is a safe and inclusive place where you can explore your sexuality in a way that is respectful yet empowering. All of their intimate films are produced ethically with their audience and performers in mind, featuring people of all races, genders, and sexual orientations, offering something for everyone. Like I mentioned earlier, they also offer immersive audio, allowing your imagination to run wild through sound and non-visual stimuli. They also provide sexual education with their Pleasure Academy, including expert-led tutorials, masterclasses, and insightful articles. Exploring your interests in sexuality can be a wonderful form of self-love and getting closer to yourself. Cheeks is the best place to do that because it is a safe and sex-positive, ethical space. Cheeks is a subscription-based service where you can choose either a monthly or annual plan, and if you use my code Madisyn, you can get free unlimited access for 7 days when you choose the yearly plan. But remember, you can cancel during any time in the trial, so really you have nothing to lose. So if you're interested in checking out Cheeks, click the link in my description. Also, can we get a little commotion for the dress? Yes, I did buy a cape. I bought a corset for this video. Did I just want to buy a corset? Yes, but I'm using this video as an excuse. Thought I'd get into the mood, into the vibe, a little spooky. Am I the only person in the Halloween store in the middle of May? Absolutely, but you gotta do what you gotta do, okay? And now I have a Halloween costume for this year early. Anyways, let's just get right into it because there's a lot to discuss. So vampire lore goes all the way back to ancient Eastern Europe. The word vampire comes from Slavic languages. In Romanian, there's a term strigoi. I'm not gonna pronounce that right, sorry to all the Romanians out there. That word comes from the Greek word strix, which means owl or witch. There was a belief across ancient Europe that dead things needed to be fed or made blood offerings, which is why they had burial practices to pacify or restrain the dead. Superstitions led to practices like exhuming bodies and staking corpses that didn't show signs of decay. Basically, people would look at these dead bodies and think, they don't look dead enough. Must be a vampire. Sometimes bodies look very bloated in the face with blood. So by the imagination of ancient Eastern European people, they're like, yep, It's a vampire. This is before science really made its proper debut, so, you know. Anyways, these tales influenced Western writers, sparking interest in the idea of a immortal bloodsucker, and in Eastern Europe, vampires were considered real. Beheading and burning to stop them was fair game and common practice amongst vampire hunters. Yes, there were actual vampire hunters back then. There were legal procedures for executing a vampire. The fear of the dead was widespread. Like I mentioned earlier, the Greek word strix means owl or witch, and vampire myths back then would overlap with witches and werewolves. All of them embodied traits like blood drinking, spreading of disease, transformation. And the vampire myth was found throughout different cultures, not just in Eastern Europe. In Norse mythology, they had the Durugar. Just know anything that's not English, I'm gonna be messing up, so sorry. And in Celtic mythology, there were revenants, which are undead beings that rise from the dead, spread disease, and attack the living. And these figures influenced later vampire lore and burial customs. Myths from Greece, Malaysia, and Eastern Europe all had vampire burials and rituals to prevent the dead from rising. When it comes to depictions of vampires, we've come a long way since the origin of vampire myths. Edward Cullen is nothing like the original concept of a vampire. Early vampire lore described vampires as grotesque, corpse-like, again tied to the fear of the dead and disease, and kind of embodied the human fear of the unknown, something that we do not deal with very well. Later on, during the Enlightenment period, vampire stories are rationalized as a means of control and linked to mass hysteria. In 1819, that's when we really start to see the crafting of the traditional vampire figure that we see in media. In the modern era, John Polidori's 1819 short story, The Vampire, introduced the aristocratic, alluring vampire archetype that we're familiar with now. This depiction shifted the image of a vampire from grotesque to suave and aristocratic and sophisticated. The Victorian era saw a surge in vampire-themed operas, plays, and novels, including Carmilla and, of course, Bram Stoker's Dracula. By the 19th century, vampires were a symbol of sexuality and also societal anxiety, which, not to give away too much of the unfolding of this video, but societal anxieties are always going to be present, was that a Freudian slip? Societal anxieties are always going to be present, but they shift and change throughout time, and that's really what the vampire is used for, as a vessel to symbolize whatever anxiety or fear that is present in the world at that time. Another huge influence on this depiction of the vampire was actually Vlad the Impaler, also known as Vlad Dracula. He was known for impaling his enemies and inspired the name Dracula, obviously. Although he was never associated with vampires while he was alive, he and his likeness were very influential on vampire lore. Once we get into films, vampires again reflect social fears similar to literature. Sometimes they're depicted as monsters in films, but sometimes they're tragic, romantic, or even comedic figures. Vampires are very versatile. What's that clip, Willem Dafoe? He's like,
He's gay, but he has a special connection to classical music. There's many things that are interesting about him.
That's me talking about vampires right now for this entire video. And then movies like Noseratu and Dracula and later films adapt the myth to new anxieties. You know, the medium of film really allows you to explore some really interesting ideas and concepts that maybe literature can't. Something that I really loved about this research was watching all these different vampire films and seeing how many beautiful, different, and creative ways filmmakers can depict vampires, and they can be so ugly but so beautiful, and it's really cool how much film has evolved in general, but especially how vampires in film have evolved and changed. And once we get into the more modern era vampires are depicted as anti-heroes, heartthrobs, as we're familiar with, again, also comedic or tragic, and as time goes on, you see the line blurring between human and monster. A few great examples of this that we will discuss more in depth later are, of course, Twilight, Interview with a Vampire, Buffy, and What We Do in the Shadows all reimagine the vampire and very unique ways that are quite different from 19th century or even early 20th century vampires. So what's going on at this time? It's post-World War I. Europe is grieving, economically in shambles. And in 1918, there was a Spanish flu pandemic which killed millions, reinforcing public fears around disease and the unseen. Pandemic, oh, that sounds familiar. And like I mentioned in the beginning, fear of vampires and disease, they go together like this. And there were other shifts going on as well at this time. Mass urbanization and industrialization introduced anxiety about anonymity, mechanization, and contributed to social decay. There was a lot changing and happening, and like I said, humans really fear the unknown, so it seems like whenever there's major shifts, whether it's in societal structures, the economy, politics, disease, we as a society tend to vibe with vampires a little bit more. Cinema emerged as a new mass medium and was able to reflect and amplify public fears through allegory and archetype. Noseratu, directed by F.W. Murnau, came out in 1922, which is a unauthorized version of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Count Orlok is the Dracula figure of this film, and he's terrifying and iconic. Truly a horror vampire icon. What would the world look like without Nosferatu? I don't know, but we wouldn't have that episode of SpongeBob.
If that was you on the phone and you on the bus, then who was flickering the lights? Nosferatu!
Probably the first time you heard of Nosferatu and you didn't even realize it. I know that was the case for me. So there's been multiple Nosferatu adaptations throughout time, but the three I want to focus on right now are, of course, the 1922 version, the original, as well as Herzog's 1979 version and Robert Eggers' 2024 version. So the 1922 version is a classic. It's a German expressionist classic. If you've taken any film class, you've probably watched this movie. The movie focuses on plague as well as nature, human nature, and the fear of the unknown. In this film, Ellen ends up sacrificing herself to defeat Count Orlok. In the 1979 version, Herzog humanizes Dracula and emphasizes existential loneliness and post-war German guilt that was going on at this time. Lucy is a much more active character in this version, and the ending is a lot bleaker. Jonathan becomes the new vampire at the end. And in the 2024 version, Robert Eggers centers Ellen as a protagonist in this film rather than Jonathan. And the plot is a lot more complex, and he adds a more explicit sexuality as well. Count Orlok is a lot more like monstrous and grotesque and more aligned with the folklore depiction of vampires, which I thought was really cool. I loved this movie. It was one of my favorite movies of 2024. You should definitely watch it if you haven't. And so each film kind of touches on those different societal anxieties and fears that were happening at this point. 1992 was post-World War I, Spanish flu, again with that fear of disease, fear of plague, and also outsiders, which is a huge theme in Dracula. The book and the original film is this fear of the other, the foreigner, essentially. And the 1979 version has a focus on existential dread and cultural trauma, and the 2024 version focuses on personal psychology, trauma, and modern horror conventions. And I think it's safe to say that in the 2020s and this part of the century, we've had more of a focus on trauma and psychology, mental health, and things like that. But don't worry, that's not all I'm going to say about Nosferatu 2024. Now, if you've seen any Dracula movie, there's a good chance it was this one. The 1931 Dracula starring Bela Lugosi's iconic portrayal of Count Dracula set the standard for vampire characters in cinema and really emphasized that charm and aristocracy that we see in modern vampires. Basically, anytime you go into a Halloween store or look at any classic depiction of a vampire is basically Bela Lugosi's Dracula. And this movie is a direct film adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, the novel. Bram Stoker's vampire is both monstrous and sexualized, reflecting Victorian fears of sexuality, queerness, and the other. The Oscar Wilde trial actually really influenced Dracula. Bram Stoker and Oscar Wilde were actually friends in real life, and so a lot of that allure and danger that is associated with Dracula actually has a queer subtext to it. And to this day, this Dracula figure, this Dracula type vampire endures because it crystallizes this web of so many different social fears that can be present at basically any time, from fear of queerness, fear of foreignness, gender, the collapse of old centuries and traditions, change in general, and it all can be funneled into this one single haunting figure. And so I think that's really why vampires will always kind of come and go when it comes to popularity throughout the years, because they will always have a space to be relevant, especially during hard times or massive social change. The novel channels anxieties about reverse colonization, xenophobia, and Britain's declining imperial power. Dracula is this Eastern European invader, and the British characters have a fear of being invaded by this primitive outsider that they don't understand. There are references to Jewish and Slavic populations as other in the novel as well. Film explores a range of themes, from the supernatural and the tension between science and superstition, as well as religion, morality, and the fear of death, classism, power, the corruption of innocence, sexuality, gender roles, and maternal symbolism, as well as madness versus sanity, and the boundaries between nature and humankind. So you can see that, with every adaptation or every interpretation of Dracula or vampires alone, there's just so much to work with. And all of these themes are explored throughout the years in different vampire films. Once you get into the 60s and 70s, this is where we see a rise in counterculture. And so at this time with, hippies and beatniks and all these different countercultures, these groups challenged traditional morality and gender roles. And with this, horror narratives grew and became more psychologically complex and symbolically became very rich in response to social liberalization. At this time, this is also the post-McCarthy era, and Cold War tension fed themes of paranoia, hidden danger, and symbolic evil at this time. PSA, Dracula is a communist. All vampires are communists. They didn't call it the Red Scare for nothing. Dark Shadows was a television show that aired from 1966 to 1971. It was a groundbreaking American Gothic soap opera set in Collinsport, Maine, following the wealthy Collins family. Not the Collins, but the Collins. This show blended melodrama with supernatural elements. They had vampires, ghosts, witches, werewolves, zombies, you name it. Ice cream trucks. Thank you. And they also had time travel and parallel universes. Anyways, moving on. The tone of the show was atmospheric and moody, often very surreal. The show kind of had a vibe of like watching a live play, because it was live to tape production. And, they even had like live mistakes and actors were improvising. And for the time, it really pushed the boundaries of daytime television. And the show was a cultural phenomenon. Interestingly enough, though, not until like 10 months after its original air, Dark Shadows initially was a ratings underdog, but once Barnabas Collins was introduced and the show embraced more of the horror and supernatural elements, they cultivated a really strong teenage fan base. The show was so successful it led to movies. There was a 1991 reboot, as well as a 2012 film adaptation that you might be familiar with. It was starring Johnny Depp. The 70s was peak blaxploitation era, so we got our first black vampire movie, appropriately named Blackula, following, let me guess, a black Dracula. Blackula was directed by William Crane, starring William Marshall, who played Blackula. The film follows an African prince who is turned into a vampire by Dracula in the 18th century, and he awakens in 1970s Los Angeles and falls for a woman who resembles his late wife. That seems to be a common theme in vampire shows and movies, is like the woman he falls in love with just so happens to look identical to his long-lost lover from 200 years ago. We see that in Vampire Diaries as well. This movie is a classic blaxploitation film in the sense that it stars a all-black / predominantly black cast. However, it does lean on both positive and negative stereotypes of the Black community, but that was pretty common for these films and 70s films in general. And although it did lack political correctness, again, it was 1972, it did allow for Black actors to be depicted in a different light other than the classic pimp or drug dealer or whatever it may be. William Marshall's performance was regal and commanding and sympathetic, making Blackula both a tragic figure and a monster. Visually, you know, the movie has got a made-for-TV aesthetic to it, but the performances legitimize the movie, I think. The makeup and effects are very, typical of this time. It was the first thing I noticed when I watched the movie. I was like, wow, those are some eyebrows. That contour is meant for the stage, honey. I don't know, it kind of adds to the period, but also the campiness of it. And you can also see at this time, vampires are still in that kind of monstrous depiction, not so much glistening in the sun, Edward Cullen types. However, the film's romance and reincarnation aspect does add emotional weight, making this film more of a love story. The quest for love is central to Blackula. Blackula was a box office hit and became a cult classic, and it won the first Saturn Award for Best Horror Film. Blood for Dracula, also known as Andy Warhol's Dracula, came out in 1974. This film offered a satirical and avant-garde take on vampire lore. This film stands out for reflecting the era's changing social values and breaking away from Hammer's established formula. Blood for Dracula follows three respectable men who secretly indulge in debauchery and are lured into a ritual by Lord Courtly and end up killing him. Courtly's death leads to Dracula's resurrection, who seeks revenge by corrupting the men's children and turning them against their fathers. The film's violence and sexuality are more explicit, with subtext around sexual repression, hypocrisy, and the allure of transgression. This film foregrounds generational conflict, from conservatism to hypocritical father figures versus the repressed but yearning youth. In this film, the patriarchs are depicted as the true villains, hiding their own moral failings behind a facade of respectability. Dracula's influence on the youth is framed as both liberating but also destructive. The narrative critiques Victorian/Edwardian moral hypocrisy, making the film more than just a standard horror entry. And I think this idea of criticizing tradition and the past goes along with that 1970s attitude of anti-establishment and counterculture. And at the time, this film was quite ambitious with its willingness to actually say something and give a social commentary. This is where things start to really get fun, in my opinion. We got punk, parody, and existentialism. I mean, what more could you ask for? So at this point, we've got economic deregulation and suburban alienation. Reagan's America was a hot mess and really set the stage for horror films centered around rebellion. We also had the AIDS crisis, which permeated narratives with fears of bodily corruption, blood, and contagion. I think more than the economy, vampires are actually a fear of disease indicator, or post-disease pandemic crisis vibes. That was really eloquent and well put, Madisyn. That was really good. But yeah, I mean, again, vampires can be symbolic of any sort of social change or fear. But if anything, I think the takeaway from this video is vampires are more of a symbol of health panic than just being a recession indicator. And I'm sure you could link recessions with post-contagious disease breakout. Anyways, what really colors 80s era vampires, which make them very unique and interesting, is youth culture and the rise of MTV and the aesthetics that come with that, which really glamorize the depiction of vampires, which is really fun, turning vampires into this symbol of both danger and desire. A classic 80s vampire depiction is The Lost Boys. It's a cult classic that really redefined vampires as these rebellious youth icons, mixing horror with rock and roll aesthetics, which is a really fun and unique, playful representation of vampires, which I think works really well. The Lost Boys follows two brothers, Michael and Sam, who move to a California beach town and get entangled into a local vampire gang. Michael is lured into the vampire lifestyle while Sam and two comic book nerds become unlikely vampire hunters. The mix of horror and comedy with the coming of age drama and teen rebellion really makes this movie a standout in the vampire film timeline. This film emphasizes the carefree recklessness of youth, as well as peer pressure and the allure and danger of never growing up. Vampirism is a metaphor for adolescence, temptation, identity, and the desire to belong. This movie truly is a time capsule for 80s nostalgia with its John Hughes style teen drama, along with that gothic horror vibe that we tend to associate with vampire films. That being said, this film isn't full on horror. The horror aspects are kind of downplayed until towards the end of the movie. And another 80s vampire film that really embodies the time period is Fright Night. Fright Night came out in 1985. It's about a teenager who discovers that his neighbor is a vampire, blending horror with comedy and 80s teen culture. Fright Night is a classic teen horror vampire film. It's straightforward and ticks off all the boxes, especially for a vampire film. This movie is praised for its traditional depiction of vampire lore, which I really appreciated because it really just kind of lays it all out there for you. The vampires are afraid of crucifixes, sunlight, they need an invitation to enter the home. It's all very classic and traditional, straightforward. In this film, vampires represent the living dead, physically alive but spiritually empty and feeding on the life force of others. Classic good versus evil, vampire bad. Not much complexity or romance to it. The need for invitation is crucial in this film, since it plays on this idea that evil can only enter your life if you allow it to, you know? The film focuses on temptation and darkness and how it can only gain power through your consent, not force, which in some ways almost feels kind of scarier. Faith and light are also emphasized in this film. Something that's unique to this movie is that in order to defeat the vampire, in order for the crucifixes to actually work, you must have faith and you must believe. It's kind of like in the Polar Express when you can't hear the bell unless you believe, right? So yeah, this is a fun movie. What was going on during the 90s? So this is peak neoliberal optimism. It's also the rise of like highbrow TV, which opened the doors for introspective supernatural TV dramas where they can really kind of like sink their teeth in to all the beautiful symbolism and metaphors that comes with supernatural figures. This is also peak second wave feminism era. Queer theory also began influencing how gender and sexuality were portrayed in horror. And at this time, vampires became a vessel for nuanced exploration of guilt, identity, and transformation. You can't talk about 90s vampires without talking about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I mean, what is there to say? It's an iconic TV show that second wave feminism influence, I think, is what brought this iconic feminist figure in TV. Buffy the Vampire Slayer was so influential on television as a whole, and again pushed forward this feminist heroine that became more present in TV as time went on. The show balanced horror and action and real emotional stakes. It had memorable relationships and characters, and the early seasons were very charming and set the tone for later TV. I feel like the early Buffy really had that like 90s teen aesthetic to it. And Buffy was really like emblematic, is that the word, of this time for teen television. The depiction of vampires in Buffy is interesting because they're basically humans possessed by demonic spirits. When a human becomes a vampire, they're void of all consciousness and they're void of a soul. They are no longer the person that they were, which I feel like is pretty different from other vampire films and TV shows. And we are back the next day with a costume change. This is a long video, guys, so I gotta film it in parts. Still in the 90s, we haven't made it out just yet. Interview with a Vampire came out in 1994. The film is based off of the Anne Rice novel by the same name. The story is told through Louis, played by Brad Pitt, who recounts his 200-year journey journey as a vampire, torn between his lingering humanity and his predatory nature. The story unfolds as an interview with a reporter serving as a surrogate for the audience, prompting reflection on the allure and the horror of the vampire's existence. The film really revolves around the perspectives of the three main characters and their dynamics between each other. Louis is transformed by Lestat, who is played by Tom Cruise. Lestat is this charismatic but amoral and remorseless vampire who was preying on Louis after a period of personal despair in his life. Lestat represents the more monstrous, amoral version of vampires, while Louis clings to his humanness, experiencing passion and regret even after becoming a vampire. And then we have Claudia, who is played by a young Kirsten Dunst, who is a child turned into a vampire and embodies the tragedy of eternal childhood. And as time goes on, her inability to grow up becomes a source of anguish and rebellion. She's probably, in my opinion, the most powerful character in this film, which was really interesting to watch because, again, she is played by a child. And as time goes by, you see how she grows and matures as a person, yet maintaining this child form. Kirsten Dunst did an incredible job in this film as a literal child. I mean, I don't know how she embodied like the energy and mannerisms of an adult woman, but I was deeply, deeply impressed and in awe watching this film. I mean, honestly, all the main actors did an incredible job. I feel like the performances were my favorite part of this film, next to the set design and the costume design. Not that it's surprising. I mean, Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt are legendary actors, but I felt like the casting was really well done. I felt like both men really embodied the characters in a way that just felt so natural. The film integrates the cost of immortality, the loss of family, the inability to change, and the endless repetition of desire and regret. And again, each character had a different relationship to immortality. Lestat was indifferent, didn't really care, embraced the darkness of it. Louis was tortured by his conscience, and Claudia was trapped in the body of a child. And I thought this movie was the most interesting and dynamic perspective on vampirism and the horrors that come with it, not for the people who are victims, but for the vampires themselves. There isn't much romanticization of vampires, unlike other films that we may see, especially later on. Instead, it presents it as this curse that strips you of your joy and any remnants of an ordinary life. From aging to family, it's all fleeting moments. And I feel like they really depicted that well through the use of sunset and the role that plays in the film. In the beginning of the film, Brad Pitt says something like, "And I watched the sunset for the last time, not remembering any sunsets that came before it." And something as simple as watching the sunset is so human, but so beautiful, and it's an everyday occurrence, but that is stripped away from him because he's a vampire. And I don't know, it just really makes you think. This hood is annoying me. I'm taking it off. I mean, I feel like most people would say that the idea of living forever sounds like hell. At least to me, it sounds like hell. I would not want to live forever. I don't really see why anyone would want to, but there are billionaires out there plotting and spending millions of dollars to try to make that happen. This film departs from the origins of vampire lore. Ultimately, the narrative of this film cautions against wishing for what can't be undone, suggesting that mortality with all its imperfections is what gives life meaning. Like I said, I loved the performances, but I also loved the visual aspect of the film. They really embodied the Gothic aesthetic so beautifully.
Interview was a production that still to this day I haven't experienced in film. Everything was mostly practical, so the lack of special effects and like a lot of stunt work, homes on fire that they built specifically to light on fire. I mean, I remember dancing with Brad in this gorgeous place in Paris. To shoot in New Orleans and Paris and London on one production, it's just those times of making movies like that, they just don't exist anymore.
I wish they still made movies like the 90s. I won't talk too much about Bram Stoker's Dracula, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, which came out in, I think, 92, because we already covered a Dracula film, but I would say that is my favorite vampire movie of all time. The first time I saw it, it really stuck with me, just the visuals and the colors, the costumes, Keanu Reeves' accent. It was just...
I know where the bastard sleeps. I brought him there. To Carfax Abbey.
I just think that movie is a work of art, and in that film they focus more on the context of Dracula as as a being, and the romance. It really is like a gothic romance. Francis Ford Coppola actually said the movie is about the power of love, and that is very evident, and also makes it more unique since, you know, the original Dracula isn't really about love. So I really enjoyed that spin on this version of the story. Now what you all have been waiting for, the romanticism and the YA boom of the early 2000s to 2010s. This is where we get into peak vampirism and pop culture. At this time, vampires were everywhere. In blockbuster films, prestige television, YA novels, fanfic, Hollywood costumes, merch, meme culture, like it was everywhere. This was definitely peak like Wattpad era. You just had to be there. If you know, you know. This happened in concurrence with the 2008 financial crisis, as well as the Occupy Wall Street movement. This period in time is truly what I think laid the seed in people's minds that vampires are a recession indicator. At this time, vampire stories tend to be more romantic and brooding, emotionally intense, and often involve abstinence, or they're like completely sexually charged. Vampires were heavily marketed towards teenagers and young adults, especially young women. A lot of the most popular vampire works of this time did come from YA novels. I think what really made this era of vampires so popular was the rise of social media platforms like MySpace and Facebook and Tumblr. I think these sites created a breeding ground for excited teenage girls who loved vampires to create fan culture, at least internet fan culture as we know it now, like Stan Twitter, that whole thing. The Team Edward versus Team Jacob phenomenon exists because of places like Tumblr and MySpace and Facebook. Tumblr GIFs, fanfics, even conventions all came together because of the internet and created this huge boom in the vampire Twilight world. I mean, these vampire books and movies became so popular that there was even a wave of backlash and parody. There was a parody movie that came out in 2010 called Vampires Suck, and of course there were SNL sketches about vampires. And thanks to Tumblr, there was the resurgence of grunge, and there was like pastel goth. Hot Topic was also super popular at this time. It all just kind of came together to create this perfect emo internet fangirl vampire realness. Anyways, let's get into Twilight. So Twilight's lifespan lasted from 2008 to 2012. So Twilight, of course, was based off of Stephenie Meyer's book series, and the film adaptation really sparked that global phenomenon, focusing on the human and vampire love story. Something that I didn't pick up on at the time, but now realize looking back, is that Twilight had a huge focus on abstinence and other conservative ideas, which is kind of a result of the Bush administration's focus on evangelical values and policy, as well as Stephenie Meyer's background in Mormonism. At this time, society was really clinging to conservative values after the election of Bush in the 2000s, and especially after 9/11. Conservatism, I Love America, that whole thing was really popular as a way to kind of get a sense of normalcy and control. Purity culture was huge back then. Don't forget, this was also around the same time that the Jonas Brothers and other Disney stars were like, I'm 16 and waiting till marriage. Look at my purity ring. Everyone needs to know as a teenager that I am not like, it was so weird back then. Twilight really leaned more into the romance and was more suspenseful with a little bit of comedy sprinkled in there. The horror elements were kind of lacking. Twilight famously rejected a lot of the classic vampire tropes. For example, they can walk outside during the daylight. It doesn't matter. They just kind of glisten a little. They don't melt and burn into little bits of ash like the other vampires do. Twilight is in the perfect time period for 2020's nostalgia. Basically anything that happened like 10 to 15 years ago is right up the millennial and elder Gen Z alley for nostalgia, especially on apps like TikTok. I've seen so many vampire/Twilight edits on TikTok with songs from the soundtrack.
Bela, where the hell have you been, Loca?
And with the series kind of revival that's occurred in the past couple years, people have looked back on Twilight with a more refreshed and critical eye. There's a lot to be critiqued about Twilight, lots of weird stuff going on in the books and the films. People, of course, have critiqued Edward as a character and how weird and kind of creepy he is, as well as the toxic dynamic him and Bella have.
I wanted to kill you. I've never wanted a human's blood so much in my life.
I trust you.
Stephenie Meyer has a background in the Church of Latter-day Saints, or LDS, or Mormonism, which is why we see such an emphasis on purity and abstinence, as well as some questionable racial politics. Vampirism is framed as an allegory for Mormon salvation, with vampires depicted as physically perfect, immortal, and crucially, exclusively white. In critiques of the Twilight series, historical LDS beliefs about race and skin color are referenced as possible subtext in the vampire transformation, as well as depictions of indigenous characters. The narrative draws on the biblical Curse of Ham and Curse of Cain, which have been historically used to justify anti-blackness, racism, and slavery. Mormon interpretations of these curses have explicitly tied dark skin to divine punishment and whiteness to salvation. Indigenous Americans are also subjected to a curse of redness in Mormon doctrine, with assimilation and righteous living supposedly leading to lighter skin. On the same topic of race, the saga is criticized for its lack of diversity and problematic depictions of race. Stephenie Meyer originally resisted casting non-white actors, citing the vampire's pale, glistening skin. She also said that black vampires can't exist in her world because the venom eats up their melanin, making them pale white. The transformation to vampire is described as leaching the pigment from the skin, so all vampires are exceptionally pale regardless of original ethnicity, and if a vampire originally had darker skin, they are still pale, but their skin has more of an olive tone. This is so interesting. And so strange. And I mean, in the movie, you can see most of the characters are white. There's like one black vampire I recall, and I just remember him being very ashy and evil. And of course, you know, the vampires of color that are described in the book are like feral, evil, uncivilized beasts, which, you know, classic racism, am I right? So yeah, the legacy of Twilight is a complicated one, especially upon reflection 10, 15 years later, but is truly one of the most influential and iconic vampire films series of all time. So back in 2008 to 2014, while you were waiting in between Twilight film releases, you could get your vampire fix right at home with True Blood. True Blood is an HBO series set in Louisiana that explores vampires integrating into society, touching on themes of discrimination and identity.
I'm a tax-paying American and small business owner in the great state of Louisiana. Who would you rather trust? A vampire or a politician?
True Blood and Twilight were out at the same time, but were very different from each other. Twilight was like the repressed, longing little sister. True Blood was the cool older sister who liked Sorry, that was a bit vulgar, wasn't it? But yes, True Blood offered more explicit sexuality and gore, and Twilight, again, sold repression and yearning teenagers. True Blood really leaned into issues around race and gender and sexuality. The series uses vampires as a metaphor for gay rights struggles. Instead of coming out of the closet, you were coming out of the coffin sort of vibe. And the show featured organizations like the American Vampire League and the Vampire Rights Amendment, mirroring real-world LGBTQ advocacy. The creator, Alan Ball, actually cautioned against reading into the metaphor too literally, noting the dangers of equating vampires, amoral, dangerous traits with LGBTQ plus people. The show resisted reducing LGBT experiences to a single narrative, highlighting internal battles within the queer community like assimilation versus separatism or monogamy versus non-monogamy, which was pretty cool because at this time especially, real-world LGBTQ organizations often had to present this like very simplified message for political effect effectiveness to kind of appeal to straight audiences. Like the Why Marriage Matters campaign shifted focus from rights and benefits to love and commitment and family, which is a much more easily digestible version of the LGBTQ community. You know, for 2008, when the show debuted, it was pretty progressive, especially during this time of political and social upheaval in the United States. That being said, of course, the show wasn't perfect. It was still 2008 after all. Some criticisms about the show are that Suki, the main character, was always being owned or had to be protected by a male character, and the show punishes any women who have sexual agency. Like there's a serial killer who targets women who sleep with vampires. Jessica, who is a young vampire in the show, is condemned to perpetual virginity due to her supernatural rules. Lafayette, who is actually the only main gay human character in the show, doesn't get a real sex scene until the final season of True Blood, and lesbian and gay relationships were shown in the show, but their intimacy was often sidelined or censored, which is pretty obvious considering how sexually explicit this show is. But overall, I think the show really depicted queer issues through the allegory of vampire in a really interesting and real way. And a lot of that stuff feels still relevant to this day, especially in this America that we are seeing today. There are a lot of storylines about the church being anti-vampire, as well as xenophobic comments all throughout the show that still resonate today, unfortunately. In the show, there's a sign that says God hates fangs, that seems like something that would happen in real life, you know, if we had vampires, gay vampires. If only we lived in a world with gay vampires. Now moving on to straight vampires, The Vampire Diaries. The Vampire Diaries was a teen drama series that delved into vampire lore, love triangles, and supernatural politics. It kind of gave me the vibes of like Pretty Little Liars, but vampires. Pretty Little Vampires. I think the show's bread and butter was the twists and turns, and the love triangle was the main appeal.
So get out of here. If I see something I haven't seen before, I'll throw $1 at it.
And Vicky Donovan's character arc from her transformation and her death was also a huge contributor to the show's popularity. For teen drama, it was very bold, and they took risks again with all the twists and turns in the plot and the dramatic character dynamics. There are a lot of high stakes going on in the show, but eventually it did meet its decline. I think its strengths became its weaknesses after a while, and eventually a lot of the high stakes and the relationships just felt forced and hard to believe. And I think the supernatural element kind of became flooded, which really diluted the original human vampire dynamic that made the show what it was in the beginning. And the show became just too reliant on kind of its gimmicks, like with the doppelgangers, for example, and eventually it just kind of lost its charm. And then Nina Dobrev left the show at a point, so it's like, why even watch it? And then they came out with the spin-off, The Originals. So yeah, I think they really just rode Vampire Diaries until the wheels fell off, but it still has a pretty strong legacy. I know it was a super, super popular show. I didn't watch it as it was coming out. I watched a few of the episodes in preparation for this video, so unfortunately I am not a Vampire Diaries stan. Unfortunately, I cannot watch multiple seasons of TV for one video, and eventually with all these vampire movies and TV shows popping up, there was a vampire fatigue. I guess you could say Hollywood sucked the life out of vampires. Even actors who were in these vampire movies were tired of it. I mean, Robert Pattinson is famous for hating on the vampire saga throughout its entire run.
When I read it, it seemed like it was a book that wasn't supposed to be published. I was convinced that Stephanie was convinced she was Bela. And especially when she says, oh, it was based on a dream, and it's like, oh, I had this dream about this really sexy guy, and she just writes this book about it. It's like, this woman is mad.
Vampire Sucks really went in on the Twilight series. It's of course a comedy, but does offer some legitimate criticism about the series.
I got a school on the reservation.
Must be fun to drink and gamble all day.
Vampire Sucks pokes fun at Twilight's pro-abstinence message, obsessive fandoms, and gender politics. The movie pokes fun at how Twilight promotes purity, but there's so much sexual tension, which is honestly like the main draw of Twilight. It's like, be really horny, but like don't actually, reel it back, because then you would be Edward is depicted as this sparkly chastity knight, while Bella, or Becca in this case is this overtly sexualized character. The film also lampoons on this infantilization of Bela / Becca with exaggerated senses of her being treated like a child by her father and Edward. And they also make fun of how the movie depicts Jacob and addresses some of the character's racial stereotypes with his life on the reservation, as well as showing Jacob as this animalistic sidekick, again, as a way to mock the original work and some of the stereotypes that are utilized in it. Now we are in present day. So what's going on, guys? For past eras, I've mentioned politics, presidents, the economy, and disease. I don't know. Let me guess. Oh yes, COVID-19. We had our own Spanish flu just a couple years ago. I think that has definitely influenced our resonance with vampire media. Obviously, there's a huge fear and collective anxiety around infection, as well as being isolated, mortality, and that also coincided with Black Lives Matter and Stop Asian Hate. And now the contemporary vampire narrative focuses on intergenerational trauma, identity, and structural power, all things that are very relevant right now. Post-vampire era, now we're seeing vampires represented as more complex and human with legitimate struggles and insecurities and issues with identity that reflect our everyday human struggles. Historically, vampires symbolized people who were considered outsiders, immigrants, Jewish people, queer people, all blending in but perceived as threats. Now, as society has evolved, modern vampire tales question who the real monsters are, often reflecting our own anxieties and divisions back at us. The monster is no longer just the outsider, but it's also us. As a society, we grapple with polarization, mistrust, and the fear that anyone could be hiding monstrous tendencies. This new wave of vampire stories really leans on emotional honesty with characters who vent and struggle and question their place in the world. They serve as a mirror to the human condition and societal fears. When it comes to using vampires as an allegory for intergenerational trauma, Sinners does this incredibly, perfectly, 10 out of 10. Hit the ball out of the park, slayed the Boots house down, etc. Like, oh my god, I cannot express how much I absolutely love this movie. So for those who live under a rock, Sinners is a film directed by Ryan Coogler. It's a Southern Gothic vampire film that is set in 1932 Mississippi, and the story follows two twin brothers, Stack and Smoke, both played by Michael B. Jordan, who return home to open a juke joint only to confront a supernatural evil. The film blends music and horror and social commentary, exploring themes of race, community, and redemption. The film again explores intergenerational trauma as well as the solidarity between Black, Irish, Indigenous, and Chinese people, which I thought was really interesting and really cool and something I've never really seen before, especially in a vampire film, of course. And the film also explores the tension between survival under oppression. Jim Crow has a huge presence in this film, of course, and the film explores the tension between survival under oppression and the pursuit of joy and community and dignity. Before I saw the film, I knew absolutely nothing about it. I went in truly blind. I just knew it was really good, and I was a little nervous that it would be like a Black struggle film. Like, there's only so many movies I can handle about Black people suffering, but that was not this movie at all. I mean, of course there is pain in the film, but it is such a beautiful and empowering film that every Black person should see, Black Americans especially. And I left that theater feeling such a deep sense of pride, and I absolutely love this movie. One of my favorite parts about this movie is how it deals with time. It's set only in one single day, and so much happens, but they also blend in the past, present, and future with music. And in the film, music is considered something that can pierce through the veil of, you know, the physical and the spiritual through past, present, and future. It's really, really beautiful the way music is depicted in this movie. And if you've seen the movie, you know exactly what scene I'm really talking about. Sammy's performing in the juke joint, and as he's playing guitar and singing, different black musical figures show up, and there's West African dancers, and there's a Jimi Hendrix-like character, and there's people breakdancing, and it blends all of these examples of past, present, and future black music, and they're all playing together, and hopefully the visuals will help you understand. I'm not sure how much I can show of the visuals because I don't want this to be copyright, so I'm sorry if it's kind of sparing. And it doesn't stop there. There's also Irish jigs going on, and again, it's really interesting how this film draws a parallel between black people and Irish people and the oppression that they've experienced. Something that really stuck with me is how religion is also talked about in this film. In the end, Jack O'Connell's character, Remick, briefly talks about how even though he says the prayers of his oppressor, it still brings him comfort, which I thought was a very interesting commentary. Unlike vampire films of the past, this film really blends this binary of good and evil and shows the humanity in all of the characters, even the ones who turn into vampires. Every character is shaped by their history and their trauma, and this film really focuses on community and solidarity rather than just pitting groups against each other. This film is now a part of a rich lineage of black vampire stories where the monster is a vessel for legacy, survival, and transformation through trauma. Black vampires differ from the European archetype. They take on a whole new meaning. When it comes to black vampires, they gather and carry ancestral memory, and their horror is communal and rooted in survival and shared pain. The vampire becomes an archivist of suffering and is shaped by violence but not defined by it. Sinners, Blackula, Octavia Butler's Fledglings, and Jewel Gomez's The Gilda stories all use vampires to explore rebirth, self-invention, and communal care. These stories allow for play, eroticism, glamour, and subversion, offering relief from the typical narratives around black suffering and permission to be extravagant, angry, and immortal. My biggest takeaway, or the question that I think the movie poses, is what does it mean to be free? What is true freedom? And it also questions assimilation and the price you pay to reap the benefits of assimilating and conforming. Accepting this vampire bite and giving into the seduction of it is an invitation into a system that promises power and access but extracts all humanity. Noseratu, which came out in late 2024, contributes to this new era of introspective vampire stories with a fresh and interesting take on the original classic. This time around, the film explores how women's sexuality and desire are demonized by patriarchal structures. Ellen is diagnosed with hysteria and is kept sedated, reflecting a historical mistreatment of women's mental health. In this version, Ellen is a fusion of Lucy and Mina, which is really interesting because she both embodies being a victim and being the courageous heroine of the story. Her relationship with Orlok explores desire and consent as well as power. The central motif here, the death and the maiden. She's a young woman and she sacrifices herself, and her character represents both agency but also patriarchal commentary. Back in the day, Gothic novels became a space for women to explore sexual and societal anxieties. Gothic heroines typically face sacrifice and repression and ambiguous agency. Gothic fiction has been criticized for how the genre blurs eroticism with violence and agency. The idea of desire is complex and often very dark, and Gothic horror tends to thrive in this moral ambiguity. Empowerment and victimhood tend to coexist. And some argue that Nosferatu and the genre invite multiple interpretations, from agency to victimhood, or even both. And finally, to close it out, I will mention Interview with the Vampire, the remix, except it's a TV show now. It aired in 2022 and is still ongoing. It really focuses on race and sexuality and immortality. In this version, Louis is a Black Creole man, and the show addresses race, class, and identity as core parts of Louis' story, and they really add a lot of depth to his character. They didn't just like switch him out for a Black guy for the sake of diversity points. They really incorporate his race into the plot. And Claudia is also played by a Black actor, and again, they add new layers to her story about adultification and vulnerability. Interview with the Vampire, like I said before, is really centered around the dynamics between the characters and their perspectives on being vampires. And in this version, the show focuses on their competing points of views and depicts all of them as unreliable narrators. Louis' story is shaped by his identity and his shame and his trauma, as well as his efforts to distance himself from his guilt and monstrosity. His narration actually shifts over time, revealing different versions of the events that take place. Claudia's perspective is also unreliable. Her diaries and memories are shaped again by trauma and shifting alliances between the two vampires. The show highlights how each character's version of the truth is subjective and shaped by their pain and their desire and their need for absolution. If you'd like a deeper analysis of the show, there's a video essay called Exploring the Complexity of Interview with the Vampire here on YouTube that you can watch. There will be a lot of videos linked in the description, and I definitely recommend you go check all of those out if you're interested in any of these movies that I mentioned or TV shows. And yeah, there's been a lot of other TV shows and movies that have popped up in the last few years featuring vampires. Midnight Mass is also a good example. That came out back in 2021, which that show blends vampirism with religion and faith. I really liked that show. It was really good and very scary. There's another Dracula story that came out in 2022 called Dracula, the Original Living Vampire. Reginald the Vampire, What We Do in the Shadows. So yeah, I think it's safe to say vampires are back, and I guess they agree. That's confirmation. So, did we answer the question? Are vampires a recession indicator? Kind of. Vampires are an indicator of a whole lot of societal mess. And if anything, it seems like vampires are a post-pandemic requisite, a post-contagion phenomenon that seems to pop up throughout history every time there is some sort of disease outbreak or political and social shift in society. So yeah, I guess vampires are more of like a symbol of societal change and fear more than anything, but obviously the economy is a part of that. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this comprehensive look at vampires. Thank you so much for watching. I'm so tired. I'm about to pass out. Give it a like, please, if you care, and subscribe. And I'll see you in the next video. Okay, bye.